Okay, we're going to continue the conversation about lessons from the midterms with reports from a number of states that featured high-profile elections this year. We've got high-profile elections and a lot of activity at the state level as well. North Carolina, where there was a successful attempt to stop Republicans from getting a supermajority in the state legislature, and from leaders from Minnesota and Pennsylvania, where actually Democrats flipped chambers in the state legislature, while of course also there were big national elections happening as well. Well, there's no better person to lead this discussion than Amy Walter, publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report. Amy has built a reputation as an accurate, objective, and insightful political analyst with unparalleled access to campaign insiders and decision makers. No one has a better grasp of the trends shaping our our political landscape. Welcome to Amy, and also New Deal leaders, North Carolina Senator Sidney Batch, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania City Councilmember Erika Strassburger, and Minnesota Senator Melisa Franzen. Invite you all up to the stage.
Thank you. Hi. I haven't met you guys yet. Amy. Erika, great to meet you. Hey, Melissa. And you're Sydney. Hey. Well, thank you guys. And thank you for having me. And thank you for coming and sitting up in front of all of your peers and giving us some good, important perspective on what happened in your respective states. Obviously, for those of us in Washington, we spend most of our time focused on the federal races, sometimes on the gubernatorial races, but there were a number of really important developments that happened at the state and local level as well. And if I had to put the two together, saying what were the trends that we saw happening both at the federal level and at the state level, it's this concept of partisan consolidation. Others are calling it calcification, where we see the reds staying red, the blues staying blue, and less purple on the map. So if we look at the Senate races, for example, in 2022 at the national level, at the federal level, obviously Democrats picked up Pennsylvania, a state that Joe Biden carried in the previous election. That means now that there are only 5 states in the country that have split delegation, right, where it's a Democrat and a Republican representing that state. There are only 3 states in the country that have that voted for Donald Trump that have a Democratic senator. There are only 2 states in the country that have a Republican member that voted for Joe Biden. That is the fewest number of split delegations that we've had since the direct election of senators. At the state level, we know that that consolidation happened as well, in part thanks to Minnesota flipping, Pennsylvania, Michigan. For the first time, this is according to NCSL, for the first time since the two-party system began, the out party did not gain a legislative chamber in this election. Republicans picked up seats, much like they did at the House level here, well, not here, but the federal level, but only 40 seats, it looks like about 40 seats total. The average is 400 seats. So much like we saw just 9 seats in the House for Republicans, which normally should be somewhere around 26. Again, that drop off on the at the legislative level as well. But when you look at the places where Democrats did well or Republicans did well, they're in the places that you would most expect. I think it's really important. I'm just going to come from the federal level. I'm going to ask these folks about what they saw on the ground at the state and local level. But what we saw at the federal levels, again, especially thinking about the Senate, the best thing Democrats had going for them going into 2022 was that they only had to win, to keep the majority in the Senate, only had to win in states that Biden carried in 2020. And they did, including Pennsylvania. Now, they came up short in Wisconsin, but where they did not win, but had very solid campaigns, North Carolina with Sherry Beasley, and Tim Ryan in Ohio. That red stayed red. In fact, while both ran impressive campaigns, they basically were within the same margin that Biden lost those states in the previous election. The other thing that my colleague David Wasserman found, and he's printing up this opus tomorrow, so go to the Cook Political Report to read it, but he has a fascinating analysis of what happened at the House side. The good news for Democrats is that in the closest races, the 32 most competitive races, those Democrats only underperformed Biden by 0.1%. They couldn't afford to lose much more than that because in some of these cases, Biden only won their districts by 3 or 4 points. So they couldn't lose much of anything, and they didn't. But in the non-competitive districts, Democrats underperformed Biden by almost 6 points. And many of those non-competitive districts are majority Black or majority Hispanic or plurality Black, plurality Hispanic districts. Turnout, at least as it looks like right now, was significantly dropped among African American Latino voters. In congressional districts that were 75% white or more, turnout was on average about 72% of what it was in 2020. But in districts that are majority or plurality Black, it was only 61% turnout from 2020, and Hispanic majority or plurality districts only 57.9%. Overall, majority or plurality minority districts only turned out at 60% compared to 72% of districts that are overwhelmingly white. So this is one way you could also help to explain how Republicans won the national vote. It looks like it'll be by about 3 points, but won just 9%. Just picked up 9 seats. So the good news for Democrats is they continue to hold on to many of those suburban districts that they picked up in 2018 that many Republicans thought would just be a quick rental, right? You got suburban Minneapolis, you get suburban Phoenix, you get suburban Dallas and Denver, but at some point those voters are going to come home. Well, they haven't come home. That's the good news for Democrats. The bad news is in places where you need to see, for especially at the presidential level, you want to get much higher turnout in majority Latino districts in the Central Valley in California or LA County in California. You did not see that turnout. Obviously, we know what happened in Florida as well. So it's sort of a tale of two coalitions. One part of the Democratic coalition absolutely showed up and was critical in many of these House districts. In others, we see that they didn't turn out at quite the same level. But I want to turn to you all because, as I said, this was quite an interesting conversation that you must have been having in your states. And Senator Batch, I'll start with you there at the end. Tell us a little bit about North Carolina. It's a state that, boy, every year we think this is that swing, this is the year, this is the swing state that's going to tip, right? When is it going to tip over? It feels a little like Lucy in the football, where it's so close. Is your district Wake County, basically?
Yes,
Okay.
Yes, I represent Southern Wake County, and you're right. It's always that, like we live in a purple state.
Right. So what happened, or what didn't happen?
That's an excellent question. Okay, so I will start with what did happen. We have, unfortunately, the Republicans spent a lot on our Supreme Court, so they have now taken the Supreme Court. We actually just got a case with our Democratic Supreme Court that actually said that political and partisan gerrymandering is, of course, unconstitutional. The Republicans knew that they wanted to make sure that partisan gerrymandering was, of course, constitutional under our state constitution, and so they put all of their money in the state Supreme Court races, and they won, unfortunately. So that is a testament to how powerful they know that they needed to play in order to change that. But as a result of that, we're also known in North Carolina for always being in court because of our maps.
That's right.
And gerrymandering, and it's horrible. But despite gerrymandering, what I would also say is that while we were fighting for, we have a Democratic governor, and then we had a supermajority in both the House and the Senate in 2018. We broke, until 2018, we broke the supermajority in 2018, built a lot of seats in 2020, got fleeced like many other states across the country in legislatures, and then we started trying to build back. In the House, they got better maps, and so we, fortunately, at the end of the election, ended up having they are 1 seat away from a supermajority in the House,
yeah.
so we can still sustain vetoes by the governor. We fell one seat short in the Senate. So we are only 1 seat short. Now, what I will tell you, though, is that we, of course, put a lot of pressure on a Republican colleague of ours who won his election, but we made it all about choice for him. And he made a lot of promises during the campaign that he wasn't going to restrict abortion and he wasn't going to do X, Y, and Z. And his seat's going to be the most competitive. There's no way around it in the next election cycle. Republicans also said that they're going to redraw our maps as soon as we get back in January.
They're going to redraw the federal map.
Federal,
too.
oh, and our state ones, yeah. And so so even though we're only 1 vote shy, we also have him on record. So if he walks, we can still sustain votes as Democrats in the legislature because he can't take a vote on choice, which is what we're trying to protect in North Carolina because we are actually the only southern state that has access to abortion up to 20 weeks. Every other southern state has lost that.
How much was that a factor, the issue of abortion? Was it really front and center in every one of the campaigns and the competitive races?
So almost everyone. So like in rural North Carolina, we lost Eastern North Carolina. We only had 1 Democrat in the congressional delegation that won. Every other Democrat lost in Eastern North Carolina. Where we saw gains is in suburban and urban areas with regards to choice, and it mattered. So I represent a very suburban district. It's 70% white, and it's 65% college educated. So well-heeled, well-resourced, they can walk and chew gum, they can worry about inflation, but also worry about choice. And so we had the ability to, of course, keep choice front and center, and we saw women come out in droves about choice. And what we did was we, of course, made my opponent an extremist on abortion, which he was. He actually said he believed that we shouldn't talk about abortion or even have access to abortion because we have a labor shortage. So that was fun. And so we talked about the reasonable roles that we could, of course, play in the choice space. So yes, I think that abortion was very important. So is the economy. And so we, as the Senate Democrats, actually drafted a lot of legislation knowing what was going to happen and framed out a lot of bills with regards to your point, economic bills that, if passed, would help millions of people in North Carolina. And then we use that in our platform to run. So we already just spent, knowing that they were going to go into a garbage can, we still filed them. And then we used that in a lot of our talking points throughout the entire election cycle.
Can we go next to Minnesota and hear a little bit about what happened there? That was, again, a bright spot for Democrats, flipping the state house, right? So now there's a trifecta. Senate, sorry. Now there's a trifecta in the state. 2 things. What do you think contributed to that? And then the second is, what do you do with that governing majority now?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to the New Deal and for all the supporters of getting this done because it did take a village. I will have to happily report that we now have a pro-choice majority in the Minnesota legislature for the first time ever. And yes, that was at the forefront of that campaign. I came into elected office in 2012 when we also had a trifecta 10 years ago, and we accomplished marriage equality, we accomplished all-day kindergarten, so there's progressive policies that are on the record of what we would do if we got it back. We lost it in 6 years ago, so I've been the minority, and I'm the minority leader right now in the Minnesota legislature, and odds were against us, right? We had redistricting. I actually got redistricted out of my own district, so I did not run for office. I would say the first element is discipline. We were disciplined of what we were going to have to do to flip the Senate. We are a 67-member chamber. We needed 34. The maps came out. We knew where we had to play. We knew we needed to put the resources there. My first job was to raise the money. And I want to say thank you to the DLCC and the States Project because they doubled down in Minnesota. And we used partnerships across the country to help us get there. I would say we have the A-team when it comes to our campaign structure. We modernized it. We made some tweaks. And I will also highlight that it was mostly women that did this work. Our campaign chair, yes, Senator Erin Murphy, woman, our campaign director for the Senate, Megan Hondo, came from us from Virginia when she helped flip Virginia before it flipped again. But we became the most flippable state chamber in the entire country this election cycle. So the money was, we've never raised so much money. We did about $8.2 million just on the Senate side. Discipline to get the right structure in place and the staff, and then we double down in those districts that we could flip. We didn't put resources to the extent that we did on the flippable to the lean Democrats. We made sure those folks had their backing from our campaign structure, and then boots on the ground. We door knocked more than 500,000 doors just the Senate campaign. That's not labor, that's not our allies, that was just us. So we've never done that before. And it was a historic effort. So the boots on the ground, the fundraising, the discipline, the messaging as well. We tailored messaging for the different parts of the state because we have suburban Minnesota is starting to be more blue, but the outskirts, what we call greater Minnesota, tends to be more red. The governor was on the ballot, the Secretary of State was on the ballot, the AG's office, and sorry, we did coin defund in Minnesota, so we knew we had to deal with that. And we had a great case with the George Floyd case where the AG was being really targeted again. So, and we also had an auditor's race statewide, and those were all just races that were really tight. But what we did was collaborate with all of them, including the House. We kept the House blue. They lost a little bit of their margins, but we kept the House blue. So it was collaboration, working with the state, all the state races, working with the House members, so we would double down on districts and not duplicate efforts. And it was really, really well laid out program. I think we can replicate that across the state, but we do need early investment. We do need to work with our partners. And quite frankly, we did have challenges too. We had funders who did not want to fund us because they thought it was a lost cause. But as we got closer and closer and closer, it was 2:21 in the morning. We were the last race, the Senate was, where we could call the last seat in greater Minnesota. And I texted the governor at 2:22 in the morning. He responded a minute later, we got you a trifecta. He said, thank you. What are we going to accomplish with that? There's a lot of pent-up demand. We have to govern. We will. There's the social issues that we will deal with, but we have a $10 billion surplus in Minnesota. And that's, I think, part of the messaging. The Republicans thought they could control that. And when they lost, they have no say anymore. So it's going to be a huge cycle for the legislature because that's just a surplus, not counting that it's also a budget year. So really great, bright spots in Minnesota. Really happy for the work. I'm sorry I'm not going to be in there, but I will help them and prop them up because it's our team. They've done a wonderful job, and they deserve to lead the Minnesota legislature. So really excited about that.
Thank you so much. Okay, and Erika Strassburger, I want to go to you now, talk about Pennsylvania, another state. You're not in the legislature, but that is another state that saw a flip. So now Pennsylvania as a state that with divided government, one of a handful of states with divided government now. But Pittsburgh was a bright spot for Democrats. I just went and looked at the, compared how John Fetterman did in Allegheny County versus Biden. He outperformed Biden by 8 points in Allegheny County, which is pretty remarkable. Talk a little bit about that. Was this as much about the fact that it was the hometown guy piece, or are Democrats, is the message that Fetterman had, that Democrats had, playing as well now in the western part of the state, and the western part of the state becoming as important as, say, Philadelphia and the Philadelphia suburbs?
Sure. Well, I think there were a couple of factors. One is there's no question in Pennsylvania and across the country, abortion was on the ballot, right? So I know that a lot of people were wringing their hands, when it comes to thinking about elections, did the Dobbs decision almost come too early, right? And that did not pan out. That did not seem to be true. Stories from the doors and when it came to the actual results. We saw record numbers of women registering to vote soon after the leak and soon after the decision itself. In Pennsylvania, 60% of new registrants were women. And we know that from polling that it showed that women, young people, and younger women were more likely to vote, and that decision actually affected their choice of candidate. So we know that that was an issue. We also know that for those who were thinking that maybe Democrats should focus more on the economy and inflation, that actually is an economic issue, right? It's an economic issue for those who want to make the choice as to how to grow their family or whether they can afford to grow their family. So that certainly resonated. And I think that the other thing that was a messaging issue, but a really wise acknowledgement, was that democracy was on the ballot, but it wasn't framed as democracy because it's a little too esoteric for voters. It was framed up as a protection of our freedoms. And both John Fetterman, Josh Shapiro, who won against an extremist insurrectionist, who was a proud insurrectionist, Doug Mastriano, for governor, and up and down the ballot as well, united behind this consistent message of protecting our freedoms. Our freedom to how and when to grow our family, our freedom to have access to clean water and air, freedom to retire with dignity, whatever it was under that banner. And you can't, it's hard to find two candidates in the Democratic Party as different from one another as Josh Shapiro and John Fetterman, right? But they both succeeded in using that message across the state, and it resonated with all sorts of people, urban, rural, center of the state, in the cities on either side. So that was one lesson, for sure.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I am curious, though, what you think, and everybody else weigh in on here, too, how the issue, then, of abortion continues to play. Obviously, in your state, this could still be an issue in the future. Well, Minnesota maybe as well. So tell me how you think this issue continues to play out.
So in Pennsylvania, there was the challenge of there was the prospect of a constitutional amendment, which would actually, in a sort of way, it was on the ballot. It wasn't a referendum, but it was the first step, and the Senate ratifying it, which then has to be ratified a second time, and then it cannot be vetoed by the governor. So the governor's sort of out of it. Most voters don't know that, but in a lot of people's minds in Pennsylvania, this was an issue on the ballot. Now that we have a Democratic, or will soon have, after some special elections occur, a Democratic majority in the state House for the first time in a decade, that risk is much, much lower. And a strong governor-elect in the form of Josh Shapiro, certainly vetoing any other attempts outside of a constitutional amendment. So I think there's a huge sense of relief for those who are concerned about that and that freedom being stripped away, and a continuing sense of being on guard for any kind of future attacks, for sure. Certainly at the local level, I mean, we're doing everything we can to demonstrate our support, and frustratingly, there's not a whole lot you can always do at the city council level, but we do everything we can to support our colleagues at the state and federal level.
Senator Franzen, I'd love you to talk about that defund the police issue, how it played in the campaigns, how you think Democrats addressed it. Obviously, there was also a ballot initiative, right, in Minneapolis the year before. So talk about, if you could, talk about that and how that may relate to other people who this issue, it seems, will still continue to be, especially when we talk about crime and criminal justice reform. It's going to be an issue that is something that Republicans want to talk about a lot. They certainly are talking about it right now in Washington as coming in as the majority. How are they talking about it in your states? How do you think Democrats should be responding?
Sure, and I think it was alluded earlier about being on the offense in terms of, in the case of the Minnesota Senate, we had put together a package to fund the police. So we had on the record the Democrats in the minority pushing for more resources, but also some reforms. So we didn't pick one or the other, reform or funding police. We knew communities need to be safe across our state, so we want to make the message clear that we were for both and more opportunity for public safety. I think it became less of an issue than abortion. I'll go back to abortion in a minute, but the way we worked on it, like I mentioned, the AG's office, that seat was up for grabs, was on the ballot, and that's where we saw most of that pressure, so it was focused on one race versus the governor versus the House and the Senate, because we were trying to move proposals. The other part too, the Republicans in the Senate did nothing. They had the opportunity to move supports for crime prevention and so forth, and they decided not to. They actually wanted that issue to be on the ballot, and that's why they did not do anything about it when we had the resource and the goodwill to get something done. The issue is not done. There was spikes in crime in districts like mine, and where we had some more aggressive and carjackings taking place. So it was on the forefront, it was on the ballot, but they saw that we were trying to do something, and the Republicans in Minnesota were being obstructionists. They were blocking any progress on that matter and others, and we had them on the record. So when you're in the minority in a chamber, your job is to keep them on the record and make sure you take those votes. I have a phrase for the Republicans, at least in the Minnesota Senate: sloppy and lazy. And that's what we saw. They thought that they were going to get the trifecta. In fact, the majority leader on the Republican side, I had tweeted that we were going to flip certain districts, which we knew we were going to flip because they were better for us after redistricting. And he said, basically, no, Melissa, that's not going to happen. I haven't responded to that tweet, but it's like, what were you saying, Paul? Because we did. And the way we did it is, again, that work on the ground and talking directly to voters. We also did the first ever broadcast buy for our caucus and spend a ton of money on that. And we targeted some districts, and some of them were on public safety, some of them were on just facts of someone running with a terrible record on abuse, and we call that ad, if you ever want to see it, we call it a decapitator, because it was a really strong ad. We got pushback, and we needed to fight fire with fire. This was our opportunity, and we got that district because we were able to really pounce on our argument. When it comes to abortion, Minnesota's a haven. We're in the Midwest. There's states across our border who are banning abortion, and they're coming to Minnesota. So now we have a majority women caucus in the Minnesota Senate, 19 women. When I went to the introductory, yes, it's exciting. First time in history. When I went to the welcome reception or meeting at the Capitol, all the Republican freshmen were all men, white men. Sorry, white men, you're fine. But our side is like mostly women, and 3 of them were the first black women in Minnesota history to ever be elected in the Senate. So we had a lot of firsts to celebrate. But because we have those women is why I think it's going to happen. It's not just codifying, but we're talking about should we put it on the ballot. We don't do that. We're not a ballot state, but we did see the Republicans put voter ID and gay marriage back in 2012 to their detriment. So maybe in this case, we saw in Michigan, it actually became a plus. So maybe we will do that. So stay tuned, but definitely we'll codify it, and definitely we know Minnesota is going to be a haven for abortion rights.
I'm going to open it up to questions after this one last question. And Senator Batch, can you talk to us a little bit, though? You talked about the Supreme Court and its influence on redistricting. What other influences will that have on what happens in your state? And is there anything legislatively that then gets impacted by that?
So I would say the primary issue is going to be on, obviously, the issues regarding redistricting. We have enough votes to sustain and to hopefully survive and prevail in 24 to flip one of the chambers and to, of course, be in a position in which we elect a Democratic governor. I will say Minnesota in some ways is actually like North Carolina's a sister state. We have in the Senate now, we have a majority women caucus, first time in North Carolina history, even though we're not in the majority. But what we have seen is also that the Republicans have tried to push all of these negative, terrible, oppressive bills with regards to social bills. We as Democrats, at least in the Senate, have been very strategic in what we actually push back on. So we file our own bills that are our opposition to them, and then we push those out all the time. I think when we move forward with regards to our courts, what we tell everyone is we can no longer rely on our courts. We are the only saving grace for all North Carolinians, and so the legislature is actually even more important than it ever will be, with choice in particular, since we are the only state in the South that has significant access to abortion. And if I may add really quickly, with regards to the defund, we were in the same situation. I was attacked on defund. Of course, they've done it to many other candidates. What I did is I went straight to camera and used one of my spots on television and just called him a flat-out liar. and said that he was lying about it and that he was just covering up his extreme positions on abortion and not paying his taxes. And I had so many, I mean, it was very cathartic, let me just tell you. Any of y'all in districts like mine where you're like fighting for your life every single time you run, by all means, just call your opponent a liar on television. And magically, you win by larger margins. And also people love you because they're like, oh my God, I'm so happy a Democrat is fighting back, because we have to fight back against that narrative. So I think we as Democrats, with a Republican-controlled Supreme Court, we're just going to have to go ahead and continue to take the fight to our Republican colleagues every single day and just try and sustain vetoes where we can.
Thank you. Questions from anybody? Will Jawando, hi. Good to see you.
So I'm going to leave, well, all of you can respond, but I'm thinking about Sherry Beasley. I wasn't alone, I'm sure, sitting like, man, we should have focused on this race more.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, well, I know you agree, and it's just an example. Maryland's similar to North Carolina, and we have a very large African-American population, for example, and there's other states that have very large, other kind of generally Democratic populations that I think the races were picked, the national races were picked, you had the key ones, and I'm glad we did well, but that was one, it's a twofer because she was a Supreme Court justice, used to be Supreme Court justice, to your point. And I would just love to hear about all of your views, but maybe starting with North Carolina, about how we're underperforming and not supporting candidates who, if they got the attention and the money, could win. And I just feel like that's a struggle in our party. We're still not there yet. I wonder if you feel the same way and how you felt about that in North Carolina or any of the other states.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and just for context, then Supreme Court Justice Sherry Beasley, the first black woman to be our chief in North Carolina, only lost by 403 votes, right? So that was just 2 years prior. And what we saw in the end is that we were not the chosen state, and they were not going to invest. So she raised a record $40 million on her own for her Senate race. And $40 million of dark money came in against her. There's no way you can compete with that. That's like separate and apart from what Ted Budd raised. And so she got ignored. We did not get the infrastructure. We did not canvass. And you saw a lower turnout. I did not rely on our Democratic Party's coordinated efforts to turn out the vote. I did that myself, which is why even in my district, which is suburban, so Brandon Lofton, Representative Lofton's here, and myself, we're two black legislators representing we're the first black representatives in very majority white districts, right? So we know that you can have a statewide black woman running and actually have a message that resonates, as we are, of course, proof that that can be done. The issue is that when you don't have the resources and you don't knock the doors that you need to, because Republicans come out to vote all the time and Democrats need to be reminded to vote, right? And they need to have a reason to go out to vote. Every single ad was a negative attack on her. So they saw her, and then they saw me calling my opponent a liar, and then they saw her, and they saw a House candidate, but it was just negative attack ads left and right. And so when you abandon an entire state and jettison them and say, oh yeah, we don't really care, we don't think that you're gonna be able to pull it through, with a woman who just lost 2 years ago by 403 votes, I think that's really bad judgment for whoever decided not to invest in North Carolina. And North Carolina is the bluest of all southern states, right? And so you can't just ignore it. We should have had a different strategy in rural North Carolina, because we can't just talk about abortion in rural North Carolina the same way we talk about it in the suburbs, but you still have to talk about things that matter. And the only way you can communicate in a state as large as ours is going to be in a position in which you actually have money. So I was very disappointed to not see the investment. And what we saw is that that actually affected every single one of our races down ballot with regards to the state legislature and also to our Supreme Court.
That's awesome. I'll just add too that in Minnesota we have the trifecta. The Senate only is up by 1 seat, and we do have our Joe Manchin. So we do need to invest. We had great candidates, and that is why we got the trifecta, and we're managing, where we are now. But we had people that just need a little extra push to get over the finish line. We want them to run again in 4 years. because we know we can get them there. We want to try to punch the incumbent who's a Republican because they should not be there and they just have a good name. So it's keeping that investment, that pressure, not just with our infrastructure, but that other partners know that we need to keep that, because one seat majority is a very difficult management. I'm glad I'm not there, but you're welcome, you got the majority. So it's something that we have to continue to push and get those candidates to re-up in 4 years and do the work from now until then to get there.
One thing we saw in Pennsylvania that I just want to draw attention to is that for the state house races, again, this is the first time Pennsylvania has seen a Democratic majority in the state house in 10 years, and our then state minority leader, our House minority leader, Joanna McClinton, a black woman, pushed hard on every single race. She supported every single candidate for the House, every single Democratic candidate for the House, regardless of how competitive it was, who they were, and provided them the resources and showed up for them in person and pushed them to work really hard. And I don't think anyone expected the House to flip in 2022. It was supposed to flip in 2024, but it paid off. That pushing hard in every single race, unsurprisingly from a black woman leader, made it happen in Pennsylvania. So I just wanted to call her out for that work.
Thank you. Anyone else? Questions, comments? I'm sorry, what did you say? We have 10 minutes. Okay. So we can just keep talking about everything else that is happening in your state. Let's talk a little bit then about 2024. Minnesota will be talked about because it always is, but it feels like it gets in the sort of lower tier of battleground states. Do you think it will be in the battleground state for the presidential this time around?
I think so, and I have a colleague here who's a mayor from Greater Minnesota, Fergus Fall Mayor, Ben Schneider, but we definitely think we should be, because it's a purple state. It is not a state, Trump almost won Minnesota. Look back at the numbers, I don't know them off the top of my head, but he did, and that is really scary. So that is, again, why I think Minnesota was at the forefront of the legislative cycle this year, because the governor, Governor Walz, been there 4 years, and with the divided government, which has not worked for him. So now he has a chance to put us in play for progress for our state, for Democrats, and that's going to bode well for the presidential. They're also vying to have Minnesota, Iowa, go before Iowa in the caucuses, which would be great too, because it is a more diverse, I argue, state for that as well. And I just think it's a very active, very middle of the road. It's about the independents. Like, that's how I won and flipped my district back in 2012. That's how we've kept it, because there's a lot of independent voters, and you have to work on the issues and tailor the message to those issues. We did not do what you did in Pennsylvania, which we targeted less races because we had limited resources, but I was everywhere. Our campaign people were everywhere. We did not stop showing up, but with limited resources, it only goes so far, and we were able to get to where we did by being very disciplined and where we spend the money.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's go to even colder place than Des Moines in January. Yay. Thanks.
I'm from Puerto Rico. If I can't handle it, you all can.
I mean, Minneapolis in January. That sounds lovely. Why can't we go to North Carolina?
You should
come on.
to North Carolina.
Let's go down there
It's
instead.
like 65 degrees
Exactly.
right now, so why not?
All right, so what's your advice then, kind of tying into what Will was saying too about focusing on this state? I do think a lot of national Democrats say, I get it, it's so close, but we spend so much money there and always come up short. Let's go and spend it instead in Arizona and Georgia and protecting the blue states that are on the edge, like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Give me your argument for why more investment into North Carolina.
So I think the biggest argument is that we're #1 in business in the entire country this past year, right? We have everyone from the West with what is happening out there. Either it's taxes, mudslides, earthquakes, whatever. They're like, hey, we want to come to North Carolina, where you have the mountains and you have the coast, and it's not, cold.
I mean, you do kind of have hurricanes, but we won't talk about that.
We have hurricanes, you're right. And so we have had a ridiculous amount of tech in the life sciences industry. We're second in life science. We're second to solar, only to California. and we're one of the fastest growing states in the entire country. They're coming from up north, they're coming from Midwest, they're coming from the West. They're not coming from the South, right? All of those voters, my district, for instance, had over 20,000 new registered voters in the last 2 years, right? And all of those people are coming from places that are blue. And they get there, and then they say, oh, wait, I'm going to register to vote. And then they find out that they're like, oh, I'm a New York Republican, but I'm not a Southern Republican. New York Republican's completely different, right? And they find that out. And I've had New York Republicans come to me and say, that's why I am an unaffiliated or I am a Democrat. Because our brand in North Carolina, of which we need to work on, is very much like we just need to rebrand. I had to run above, I was running a lot of points ahead of just the generic Democrat. But I also said, I voted for the largest tax cut in North Carolina history. I'm a gun owner. I support choice, and I support the police, and was very pro-law enforcement. But in my district, which is unaffiliated, has a bunch of soccer moms like myself, I had to then, I fit the district, but I also had to talk about people and all of the moderate issues that happens to be North Carolina. And so I think as the demographics change in North Carolina, we are going to be the state that people need to watch, because all of those individuals are coming from different places for all the benefits that you have in North Carolina, and they're not coming from Mississippi or Texas.
Right. They're coming in there. It looks like we have Congressman Ryan on deck. So with that, thank you all very much. Thank you all for your perspective. That was fantastic.